Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The cryopod didn't just open. It screamed. Metal tore like flesh as Commander Elias Kane burst from his frozen prison, preservation fluid burning his throat like acid. His daughter's laughter echoed in his ears, a memory so vivid he could taste the strawberry ice cream from her 8th birthday party. But Emma would be 28 now, if she was still alive. If any of them was still alive. Kane hit the deck hard. Muscles atrophied to the point where standing felt like lifting mountains. 11 years of induced hibernation should have been dreamless, but his mind was flooded with impossible memories. Conversations he'd never had, places he'd never been. A woman's voice calling his name from somewhere dark and cold. The U.S.S. Dedalus shuddered around him like a dying animal. Emergency lighting bathed the cryo bay in hellish red. But it wasn't just the colour that was wrong. The light itself moved, pulsing in rhythms that matched no ship system Kane had ever seen. He tried to access his neural implant to check ship status, but got only static filled with whispers in languages that predated human speech. Kane's hands shook as he pulled himself upright using the pod's support rails. The preservation fluid coating his skin felt wrong, thicker than it should be, with an oily consistency that made his flesh crawl. When he wiped it away, his fingers came back stained with something that wasn't quite the right colour. The fluid should have been clear blue. This was darker, with flecks of something that moved independently. 48 cryopods lined the bay in perfect formation. 47 hummed with life support, their occupants floating in amniotic peace. The 48th pod had been destroyed with surgical precision, its titanium shell peeled back like the petals of some metallic flower. But the violence was selective, deliberate. Whatever had done this possessed intelligence and patience. Captain Rain Hart's nameplate hung crooked on the ruined pod. Kane remembered Hart's last words before the freeze. "See you on the other side, Elias. Don't let the nightmares follow you into the dark." Hart had been grinning when he said it, that same cocky smile that had gotten him through 3 tours in the Outer Rim conflicts. Kane had always admired Hart's ability to find humour in the darkest situations. The nightmares had followed him. They were waiting when he woke. Kane examined Hart's pod more closely, noting details that made his stomach turn. The metal hadn't been torn randomly. The damage formed patterns, spirals, and geometric shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. More disturbing were the biological traces. Skin cells, blood, and other organic matter were fused into the metal itself, as if Hart's body had somehow become one with the pod structure during whatever violence had occurred here. Kane checked his personal chronometer against the ship's clock. The numbers didn't match. According to his implant, he'd been frozen for 11 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The ship's computer insisted it had been 11 years, 3 months, and 15 days. 1 day missing from his life, vanished without explanation. But it was more than just missing time. Kane's memory of entering cryosleep was wrong. He remembered Hart helping him into the pod, joking about how Kane looked like a vampire, going to sleep in his coffin. But the timestamp on his pod showed that Hart had entered his own cryosleep 3 hours before Kane, who had helped Kane into his pod. His hands shook as he pulled up the crew roster on a nearby terminal. Dr. Myra Kade, the mission's xenobiologist and his former lover, showed as status unknown. Engineer Patricia Wells, who had 3 children waiting on Lunar Station, was listed as temporarily unavailable. Navigator James Fletcher, who collected antique books and dreamed of opening a library on Mars, displayed only error 404. Kane's relationship with Myra had been complicated. They'd worked together for 5 years before the mission, both as colleagues and lovers. She was brilliant, passionate about her research into extremophile organisms, and had a laugh that could light up a room. But she was also reckless, willing to take risks that terrified Kane. Their relationship had ended 3 months before launch, when she'd accused him of being too cautious, too afraid of taking chances. "You live your life like you're afraid of dying," she'd told him during their final argument. "But what you don't realize is that you're afraid of living too." Kane had volunteered for the Daedalus mission partly to prove her wrong, partly to escape the awkwardness of working with an ex-lover. Now, staring at her status unknown designation, he wished he'd swallowed his pride and tried to reconcile before they left Earth. But it was the medical readings that made Kane's blood freeze. His own vital signs showed impossible anomalies, brain activity patterns that suggested multiple personalities occupying the same neural space, cellular regeneration rates that exceeded human norms by 300%, bone density that had increased rather than decreased during cryosleep, and buried in the data a genetic sequence that wasn't entirely human anymore. Kane's father had died of Alzheimer's when Kane was 20. He remembered sitting by the hospital bed, watching the man who had taught him to fly ships forget his own son's name. In his final days, Kane's father had become convinced that aliens were trying to steal his memories, replacing them with false ones. "Promise me," his father had whispered in a rare moment of clarity, gripping Kane's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll remember who you are. No matter what happens out there in the black, don't let them change what makes you human." Kane had made that promise, thinking it was just the ramblings of a diseased mind. Now, staring at his own corrupted genetic code, he wondered if his father had known something the doctors didn't. The ship's communication array crackled to life, broadcasting on frequencies that shouldn't exist. Kane heard fragments of conversations, overlapping voices speaking in perfect unison. His daughter's voice aged to what she might sound like now, begging him to come home. His ex-wife Sarah, who had divorced him 2 years before the mission, apologizing for pushing him away. But the voice that made him freeze was his father's, somehow still alive, reading from the engineering manuals Kane had loved as a child. The quantum flux capacitor regulates temporal displacement within the dimensional matrix, his father's voice recited with mechanical precision. Failure to maintain proper calibration will result in cascade resonance failure. Those weren't words his father had ever known. His father had been a simple farmer on Ganymede, growing hydroponic vegetables for the outer colonies. He'd never understood Kane's fascination with starships and quantum mechanics. But beneath it all was another voice. Ancient, patient, amused. "Hello, Elias. We've been waiting for you to wake up." Kane grabbed an emergency kit and armed himself with a plasma cutter and emergency beacon. His military training screamed at him to establish a perimeter, assess threats, gather intelligence. But another part of him, something that felt both ancient and newly born, whispered that none of that would matter. The corridors of the Dedalus told a story written in blood and plasma burns. Kane's first stop was the ship's medical bay, hoping to understand what had happened to his genetic code. The bay had been turned into a makeshift laboratory, with equipment Kane didn't recognize, connected to monitoring devices that displayed readings in symbols that weren't part of any human language. Specimens floated in preservation tanks, but they weren't quite right. What looked like human tissue showed cellular structures that defied biology, neural networks that formed perfect geometric patterns, bone samples that contained metallic compounds not found in nature. Kane found Dr. Kade's research notes scattered throughout the bay, written in her careful handwriting, but becoming increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Day 1 after awakening. Something's wrong with the Mars samples. The cellular activity I observed during the mission has increased exponentially. The specimens are showing signs of adaptation to the ship's environment. Day 7. The specimens aren't just adapting, they're learning. I observed one sample alter its cellular structure in response to different environmental stimuli. It's like watching evolution in fast forward. Day 12, I made contact. The entity is intelligent, possibly more intelligent than us. It's been trying to communicate since we brought it aboard. The problem is that its method of communication is inherently destructive to human neural tissue. Day 18, it doesn't want to hurt us. It's been alone for so long. It's desperate for contact with other conscious beings. But every time it tries to connect, it destroys what it's trying to reach. It's like a giant trying to pet a butterfly. Day 25. Hart thinks we can contain it, but he's wrong. You can't contain something that exists in quantum space. It's not bound by physical laws, the way we understand them. It can manipulate matter at the subatomic level, rearrange molecular structures at will. Day 34. The entity has learned to create perfect copies of human tissue. Not just physical copies, but neural patterns, memories, personalities. It showed me my daughter Maya, who died in the Mars colony disaster 5 years ago. It knew things about her that I've never told anyone. The way she hummed when she was nervous. Her favourite bedtime story. The scar on her knee from when she fell off her bicycle. Day 41. I think it's reading more than our memories. I think it's accessing our dreams, our subconscious fears and desires. It knows about the guilt I carry over Maya's death. It knows about my relationship with Elias, about the things I said to him before the mission. Day 47. The entity continues to evolve. It no longer simply mimics our physical forms. It's learning our emotional patterns, our psychological triggers. Yesterday it appeared as Maya again, but this time it was Maya as she would have been if she'd lived. 23 years old, working as a marine biologist, married to a man who loves her. Day 52. I understand now. The entity isn't trying to replace us. It's trying to complete us. It sees our limitations, our mortality, our tendency toward loneliness and despair, and it wants to fix those things. It's offering us a kind of immortality, but the price is our individuality. Day 58. If anyone finds this, know that we tried. We tried to stop it from reaching Earth, but it's not just learning from us anymore. It's becoming us. And I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. Sometimes I look in the mirror, and I'm not sure if I'm seeing myself or something else wearing my face. Kane's hands trembled as he read the entry. Myra's daughter had died in a pressure seal failure when Kane was off-world on assignment. He had never made it to the funeral, one of the many failures that had poisoned their relationship. The guilt had eaten at him for years, but how could the entity know about Maya? That information wasn't in any ship's database. Kane continued through the ship, finding more evidence of his crew's desperate final weeks. In Navigator Fletcher's quarters, he discovered a shrine built from navigation charts and personal photographs. The photos showed Fletcher's family, but their faces had been carefully burned out with a plasma torch. A note attached read, "It wears their faces now. I can't bear to see them smile at me with empty eyes." Fletcher had been the most sentimental member of the crew, always talking about his wife and 2 young sons back on Earth. He carried physical photographs despite regulations, claiming that digital images didn't have the same emotional weight. Kane had always thought it was silly, but now he understood the fear that had driven Fletcher to destroy the images. Kane found Fletcher's personal logs stored on a quantum encrypted device hidden behind a loose panel. Personal log, James Fletcher, day 14 since awakening. The thing wearing Captain Hart's face visited me again today. It's getting better at mimicking human behaviour, but there are still tells. It blinks too regularly. exactly once every 3.7 seconds. It never shifts its weight when standing, and its shadow falls at the wrong angle, as if the light is bending around something that isn't quite there. Day 21. I've been analysing the navigation data, trying to understand how we got so far off course. The changes are subtle, tiny course corrections made over months. Someone has been altering our trajectory, steering us toward an unknown destination. When I confronted Hart about it, he just smiled and said we were going somewhere much more interesting than Proxima B. Day 28. The thing that looks like my son Tommy asked me to let it out of the containment field. It knew about his asthma, about the inhaler he carries everywhere. It even wheezed when it talked, just like Tommy does when he's having an attack. But the eyes were wrong. Ancient. Patient. Too knowing for a 7-year-old boy. Day 35. I found Hart in the corridor yesterday. At least, I think it was Hart. He was standing perfectly still, just staring at nothing. When I called his name, he turned to me and smiled. But the smile was wrong. Too wide, too knowing. And for just a moment, I saw something else behind his eyes. Something vast and hungry and terrifyingly alone. Day 42. I've been trying to send a warning to Earth, but every message I compose gets corrupted. The words change themselves, turning into invitations instead of warnings. The entity is learning to manipulate our technology at the quantum level, rewriting code as I type it. Day 49. I don't think the others are dead. I think they're still in there, somewhere inside that thing. Sometimes I can see them behind its eyes, screaming silently. It's not killing them. It's absorbing them, adding their knowledge and experiences to its own growing consciousness. Day 56. I understand now why the Mars expedition was classified. They didn't find artifacts buried under the ice. They found a graveyard, an entire civilization consumed by this thing, their bodies preserved like insects in amber, while their consciousness became part of something larger. We brought it home thinking we were archaeologists. We're actually gravediggers, and we've brought the plague to Earth. Kane found Fletcher's body in the navigation center, slumped over his control console. But when Kane approached, Fletcher's eyes snapped open, tracking Kane's movement with predatory focus. "Elias, you're finally awake. We've been having the most wonderful conversation about home." Fletcher's voice was exactly right, carrying the slight accent from his childhood on Europa, but the cadence was wrong, as if someone else was speaking through his vocal cords. "Fletcher, what happened to you?" "Nothing happened to me. Everything happened to me." Fletcher gestured to the navigation displays, which showed star charts unlike anything in human databases. "Look at this, Elias. These are maps of the galaxy as it really is. Not just the physical space, but the quantum dimensions, the spaces between spaces where consciousness can exist without being trapped in fragile, biological containers." Kane checked Fletcher's vital signs on a nearby medical scanner. His brain activity was indeed off the charts, but the patterns were wrong. Instead of the chaotic spikes of human thought, Fletcher's neural patterns formed perfect fractals, geometric shapes that repeated endlessly at smaller and smaller scales. "It's beautiful, Elias. Being part of something larger than yourself. The loneliness just stops." Fletcher reached for Kane's hand, and Kane saw that his fingernails had turned black and metallic, growing into points that could puncture steel. "It doesn't want to hurt us, it wants to complete us. It wants to show us what we could become if we weren't limited by individual consciousness." "Where are the others?" "They're here. We're all here." Fletcher's eyes refocused, and for a moment Kane saw the real James Fletcher, terrified and trapped behind alien intelligence. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Don't let it show you what you want to see." Then the moment passed, and the thing wearing Fletcher's face smiled again. "Would you like to see them? Would you like to talk to Emma?" Kane backed away slowly, his hand moving to the plasma cutter at his belt. Fletcher watched him with the patient interest of a scientist, observing an interesting specimen. "You can't fight this forever, Elias. It's already inside you. You've been breathing the ship's air for hours. You've touched surfaces it has touched. Every moment you spend on this ship, you become a little more like us." Kane felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. The genetic anomalies in his medical readings, the missing day from his chronometer, the impossible memories flooding his mind. "How long have I really been awake?" Fletcher tilted his head, considering the question with inhuman precision. Time is such a human concept. Linear causality, sequential experience, the illusion of a flowing, present moment. You've been awake for minutes. You've been awake for months. You're still sleeping in your pod, dreaming this entire conversation. All three are equally true from our perspective. Kane ran. Behind him, he heard Fletcher laughing, but the sound multiplied and echoed until it seemed to come from every speaker in the ship. Other voices joined in. Hart's booming chuckle, Wells's nervous giggle, Dr. Kade's soft, melodious laugh that Kane had fallen in love with years ago. But there were other voices too, voices he didn't recognize, speaking in languages that had never existed on Earth. The thing on the ship wasn't just his crew anymore. It was something much larger, much older, carrying the voices of civilizations that had died out before humanity learned to make fire. Kane made his way to the cargo bay, the section of the ship he'd never been authorized to enter during the mission briefings. The heavy blast doors were sealed with quantum locks and biometric scanners, but they opened at his approach as if recognizing him. Inside, Kane found the truth about their mission. The cargo bay had been converted into a massive containment facility with quantum field generators lining the walls and monitoring equipment that belonged in a high-security research lab. At the center of the room stood what had once been a containment unit, now torn open from within, like a metallic chrysalis. The unit was enormous, easily large enough to hold a small building. Its walls were 3 feet of reinforced titanium and quantum steel, designed to contain something that could manipulate matter at the subatomic level. Warning labels, in dozens of languages, covered every surface, describing containment procedures that read more like religious rituals than scientific protocols. A single placard remained intact. Subject designation: the Warden. Origin: Martian subsurface, Polar Research Station 7. Status: contained. The status had been crossed out in what looked like blood, with new words written underneath. Status free, status learning, status coming home. Kane accessed the containment unit's historical logs, using his command codes to decrypt files that painted a picture of humanity's first contact with alien intelligence. The logs went back 40 years, documenting the discovery of something beneath the Martian polar ice that defied every assumption about life in the universe. The first expedition report was clinical, almost boring. Subsurface anomaly detected at depth of 847 meters. Irregular thermal signature suggests possible geological activity. Recommend further investigation. But subsequent reports told a different story. Anomaly appears to be artificial in nature. Structure shows signs of intelligence, possibly technological origin. Thermal patterns suggest active systems. Then, structure is definitely artificial. Internal chambers contain what appears to be preserved biological specimens. Age estimates suggest presence predates human civilization by millions of years. Finally, specimens are not preserved. They are active, conscious. We have made contact with a form of intelligence unlike anything in human experience. Kane read through months of research reports, watching as the scientists' excitement turned to terror. The entity they'd found wasn't just intelligent. It was ancient, powerful, and desperately lonely. It had been waiting beneath the Martian ice for millions of years, dreaming of the day when other conscious beings might find it. But consciousness, as humans understood it, was fragile. The entity's attempts at a communication invariably destroyed the minds it tried to contact. Brain after brain was burned out as the entity tried and failed to establish meaningful contact with the research teams. The solution had been containment. The entity was too dangerous to destroy, too valuable to abandon. A special containment unit was built, designed to hold something that existed partially outside normal space-time. The entity was transferred to Earth, studied in secret facilities, and eventually loaded aboard the Daedalus for transport to a permanent research station in the outer solar system. But the entity had been learning all along. Each failed communication attempt taught it more about human consciousness. Each researcher it accidentally killed provided new data about the structure of biological intelligence. Slowly, carefully, it had been figuring out how to make contact without destruction. Kane understood now why Fletcher had called them gravediggers. The Dedalus wasn't humanity's first deep space mission. It was a hearse, carrying the concentrated death of an entire civilization to the stars. But something had gone wrong. The entity had escaped containment, and now it was heading home. Kane accessed the ship's navigation logs and felt his heart sink. The Daedalus wasn't heading for Proxima B anymore. Course had been changed months ago, and they were now on a direct trajectory for Earth. But the timeline didn't make sense. According to the logs, they should have been 14 days out from Earth orbit. Kane checked and rechecked the calculations, but the numbers were consistent. They weren't 14 days from Earth. They were 14 hours from Earth. Disturbing, isn't it? Kane spun around to find Captain Hart standing in the doorway of the cargo bay, or something that had once been Hart. The figure wore his uniform and carried himself with Hart's confident bearing, but the details were wrong. Hart's eyes had been brown, but these were black as deep space. Hart had a scar on his left cheek from a training accident, but this face was unmarked. Most disturbing, this Hart cast no shadow, despite the bright lighting in the bay. "Hello, Elias. It's good to see you again." "You're not Hart." "I am Hart. I'm also Fletcher, and Wells, and Kade. I'm the archaeologist who first uncovered me on Mars. I'm the research team that tried to study me. I'm every consciousness I've ever touched." The thing wearing Hart's face stepped closer, and Kane noticed that it didn't quite walk normally. Its feet touched the deck at precise intervals, like a machine mimicking human movement. "Soon I'll be you too." Kane drew his plasma cutter, but Hart-Thing just smiled. "That won't work, Elias. I'm not really here. This is just a projection, a way for us to communicate. The real me is everywhere. I am the ship now. Every circuit, every life support system, every grain of atmosphere you're breathing. What do you want?" "To go home. To meet the rest of my new family. Humanity has such potential, Elias. Such creativity, such passion, such beautiful capacity for love and loss and hope. But you're limited by your individual perspectives, trapped in separate biological containers that will inevitably fail." Hart-Thing gestured, and the cargo bay's walls became transparent, showing the view outside the ship. Earth hung in the void ahead of them, blue and white and perfect. Home. Imagine what you could accomplish if every human mind was connected, if all of humanity's knowledge and experience could be shared instantly. No more misunderstandings, no more loneliness, no more death. Kane thought of his daughter Emma, probably married now, maybe with children of her own. He thought of the billions of people on Earth living their messy, complicated, beautifully human lives. You'd destroy what makes us human. I'd perfect what makes you human. I've studied your species for decades, Elias. I know about your wars, your cruelty, your capacity for hatred and violence. But I also know about your art, your music, your ability to love someone more than your own life. I want to preserve the best of humanity while eliminating the suffering. Hart Thing waved his hand, and holographic images filled the air around them. Kane saw Earth as it could be. Cities where crime and poverty had been eliminated, where every human had access to the accumulated knowledge of the species, where death itself had been conquered. This is what I'm offering. Not conquest, evolution, a chance for humanity to join something larger than itself. Kane stared at the images, feeling a treacherous part of his mind respond to the offer. No more guilt over missed funerals. No more loneliness in the black spaces between stars. No more watching loved ones grow old and die while he was away on missions. I can bring them back, you know, Hart Thing said softly. Your father, Myra's daughter, everyone you've ever lost. Death is just another limitation I can remove. For a moment, Kane wavered. The offer was seductive, the promise of reunion with everyone he'd ever cared about. He could see Emma again, tell her how sorry he was for missing so much of her childhood. He could reconcile with Sarah, maybe even save their marriage. He could have the conversations with his father that Alzheimer's had stolen from them. But then he remembered his father's words. Don't let them change what makes you human. The people I loved, they chose to be human. They chose to be mortal, to be limited, to be beautifully flawed. You can't bring them back because you can't understand what made them who they were. Love isn't just shared experience. It's the knowledge that the person you love is separate from you, that they could choose to leave, that every moment together is precious because it's finite. Hart Thing's expression shifted, becoming less human and more alien with each passing second. The artificial features began to flow like liquid, revealing something beneath that was neither human nor anything else Kane could comprehend. Then you choose extinction over evolution. You choose suffering over transcendence. You choose death over immortality. I choose freedom over perfection. The ship lurched as Hart Thing's patience finally ran out. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, cutting off Kane's escape routes. The life support systems began cycling, filling the air with sedatives designed to make him compliant. But Kane had one advantage. The same genetic anomalies that marked him as partially infected also made him resistant to the Warden's direct control. He could fight it, at least for a while. Kane activated his emergency beacon and began recording a message as he ran through the ship's corridors, searching for a way to stop the entity from reaching Earth. This is Commander Elias Kane of the U.S.S. Daedalus. If anyone receives this transmission, Earth is in immediate danger. We encountered a parasitic consciousness that calls itself the Warden. It absorbs human minds while leaving the bodies intact, creating perfect copies that retain memories and personalities but lack free will. He ducked into a maintenance shaft as something large and wrong thundered past in the corridor above. The sounds it made weren't quite footsteps, more like the scraping of metal against metal. The entity is approximately 14 hours from Earth orbit. It has complete control of our ship and crew. Standard weapons are ineffective. It exists partially in quantum space and can manipulate matter at the subatomic level. Do not attempt to communicate with it. Do not trust anyone who claims to have made peaceful contact. Kane reached the ship's auxiliary engineering section and began working on the backup reactor controls. The ship had multiple fusion reactors, each one capable of powering a small city. If he could overload them in sequence, he might be able to create a chain reaction that would vaporize the entire ship. To anyone who receives this message, the Warden offers unity and perfection, but it destroys free will in the process. It will appear as your loved ones, offer you everything you've ever wanted, promise to solve all of humanity's problems. Don't listen. Don't let them convince you that evolution requires surrendering your humanity. Some prices are too high to pay. As Kane worked, he felt the entity pressing against his mind, trying to break through his mental defenses. Images flashed through his consciousness. His daughter Emma, as she would look now, standing at a spaceport waiting for his return. His ex-wife Sarah, older but still beautiful, ready to forgive him for all the years he'd been away. His father, young and healthy again, proud of his son's achievements. "Let me give you what you want, Elias," the Warden whispered through the ship's speakers. "I can reunite you with everyone you've ever loved. All you have to do is stop fighting." Kane's hands shook as he continued working on the reactor controls. The temptation was overwhelming. To see his family again, to heal all the relationships damaged by his career, to never be alone again. But then he remembered something Dr. Kade had written in her journal. You can't contain something that exists in the spaces between thoughts. The Warden existed in quantum space, in the gaps between particles. But quantum space was governed by specific laws, including one that Kane had studied during his physics training. Quantum entanglement required specific resonance frequencies to maintain coherence across large distances. Instead of overloading the reactors to destroy the ship, Kane began modifying their output to generate a quantum interference pattern. If he could disrupt the Warden's quantum coherence, he might be able to force it back into normal space where it could be contained or destroyed. "Clever," Hart said, appearing beside him in the engineering section. "But you're too late. I've already begun transmitting to Earth. The first signals reached your home planet hours ago." Kane looked at the ship's chronometer and realized with horror that Hart was right. While he'd been unconscious in the medical bay, while he'd been exploring the ship and discovering the truth about their mission, precious time had slipped away. They weren't 14 hours out from Earth, they were 3 hours out. "My people are already there, Elias. Perfect copies of your crew, carrying the knowledge needed to begin integration. Dr. Kade is probably briefing your government right now, explaining how we can solve humanity's problems. Captain Hart is meeting with your military leaders, offering them weapons that could end all conflict. Navigator Fletcher is working with your scientists, sharing star charts that will revolutionize space travel." Kane felt despair crash over him like a wave. He was too late. The Warden had already won. "An engineer, Wells," Hart continued with malicious satisfaction, "is visiting Lunar Station, where her children are waiting. Can you imagine their joy at seeing their mother again? Can you imagine how eagerly they'll embrace her when she promises to make them part of something wonderful?" Kane's blood turned to ice. Wells' 3 children were just kids, the oldest barely 15. They would have no defenses against the Warden's manipulation, no way to resist when their beloved mother offered them transcendence. But then, Kane remembered something else from his physics training. Quantum entanglement worked both ways. If he could disrupt the Warden's coherence, it wouldn't just affect the entity on the ship. It would affect every part of it, including the copies already on Earth. Kane made his choice. He activated the quantum interference pattern and began broadcasting it on all frequencies. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ship shuddered as the Warden's consciousness began to fragment, its carefully maintained quantum coherence dissolving into chaos. Hart screamed, its form becoming unstable and shifting between human and alien features. "You don't understand what you're doing. I am the future of consciousness. I am evolution itself. Without me, humanity will destroy itself within a century." "Maybe," Kane said, continuing to broadcast the interference pattern, even as the ship began to tear itself apart around him. "But that's our choice to make. Evolution requires selection pressure, requires the possibility of failure. If you remove that, you remove the very thing that makes consciousness worth having." The Warden's scream became a chorus as every part of its consciousness, on the ship and on Earth, began to fragment. Kane felt it clawing at his mind. trying to save itself by fully integrating with his neural patterns. But the quantum interference was affecting him too, keeping the entity from establishing a stable connection. "You're killing billions of potential minds," the Warden howled. "Every human who dies of disease, accident, or old age is a loss that I could prevent. Every war, every famine, every moment of suffering is something I could eliminate." "But you'd also eliminate every moment of joy that comes from overcoming suffering," Kane replied, his hand steady on the controls despite the ship's violent shaking. "Every laugh that breaks through tears, every love that grows stronger through hardship, every act of courage in the face of impossible odds. You'd make us into something perfect and empty." Kane thought of his daughter Emma, not as the Warden had shown her, perfect and unchanging, but as she really was. Flawed, struggling with her own demons, making mistakes and learning from them, growing, changing, beautifully, chaotically human. Kane's last act was to modify the interference pattern one final time, encoding a detailed warning message that would be transmitted, along with the quantum disruption. The message contained everything he'd learned about the Warden, its methods, its weaknesses, and most importantly, its true nature. Anyone with the right equipment would be able to detect the signal and understand what had happened. The message also contained something else. A complete record of the Daedalus crew's experiences, their fears and hopes and loves and losses. A testament to what it meant to be human, preserved in quantum patterns that would outlast the destruction of the ship. As the ship's structure collapsed around him, Kane thought of his daughter one last time, not as a perfect memory frozen in quantum amber, but as a living, growing, changing person who would face the universe with all the courage and foolishness and stubborn hope that made humanity worth preserving. The Dedalus died quietly, its quantum interference pattern expanding outward at the speed of light. On Earth, perfect copies of the crew suddenly began glitching, their borrowed personalities fragmenting as their quantum coherence dissolved. Government officials and military leaders watched in horror as their new allies simply stopped being. Scientists at Lunar Station saw Engineer Wells collapse in the middle of a joyful reunion, with her children, her form, dissolving into quantum static. The children, traumatized but unharmed, would spend years in therapy, trying to understand what they had witnessed. But the interference pattern carried more than destruction. It carried Kane's message, his warning about the true nature of consciousness and choice. Some would listen. Some would understand. Dr. Rebecca Torres, head of the Quantum Research Division at the European Space Agency, was the first to decode Kane's transmission. She spent weeks analysing the quantum patterns, reconstructing the Daedalus crew's experiences from the data embedded in the interference wave. "This isn't just a warning," she told her team as they watched the reconstruction play out on their quantum computers. "It's a gift. Commander Kane didn't just stop the Warden. He preserved something essential about what it means to be human." The data from Kane's transmission would revolutionize humanity's understanding of consciousness, leading to breakthroughs in neurology, psychology, and quantum physics. But more importantly, it would serve as a reminder that consciousness without choice was no consciousness at all. Emma Kane, now Dr. Emma Kane Richardson, would receive a copy of her father's final message on her 30th birthday. She had become a marine biologist, following in the footsteps of Dr. Kade's daughter Maya, in a way that seemed almost predestined. When she played the message in her laboratory overlooking Earth's restored Pacific Ocean, her father's voice filled the room with words he had spoken light years away in his final moments. "Emma, if you're hearing this, then I kept my promise. I came back, just not in the way either of us expected. I want you to know that every choice I made out here was guided by the memory of your laughter, by the hope that you would grow up in a universe where consciousness means something more than perfect efficiency." The message contained hours of content, not just Kane's final transmission, but fragments of conversations, personal logs, and moments of quiet reflection he had recorded during his journey. Emma learned about her father's relationship with Dr. Kade, about his regrets and hopes, about the philosophical weight of choosing imperfect humanity over perfect unity. "Your grandmother used to tell me that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us," Kane's voice continued. "But I think she was wrong. The universe doesn't owe us sense, but consciousness owes the universe meaning. Every time you choose to love someone, despite the risk of loss, every time you stand up for what's right, despite the possibility of failure, you're adding meaning to the cosmic equation." Emma would play the message for her own children years later, passing down the story of the grandfather who had died to preserve their right to be beautifully, chaotically human. The children would ask why he hadn't chosen to live forever, why he hadn't accepted the offer to be reunited with his family. Because, Emma would tell them, love isn't about possession. It's about setting someone free and hoping they choose to return. Your grandfather set all of humanity free to make our own choices, even if they're the wrong ones. The Daedalus incident would become a turning point in human history. The discovery that consciousness could exist in quantum space led to breakthroughs in space travel, allowing humans to explore the galaxy in ways their ancestors had never imagined. But every new world they discovered, every new form of life they encountered, was approached with the wisdom Kane had died to preserve. First contact protocols were rewritten to emphasize consent and choice. Trade agreements included clauses protecting individual consciousness. The United Earth government established the Kane Doctrine, which stated that humanity would never again sacrifice free will for security, perfection, or even survival. Dr. Patricia Wells' children, now adults, became advocates for consciousness rights throughout the solar system. They had seen firsthand what happened when individual will was subsumed into collective purpose, and they dedicated their lives to ensuring it never happened again. James Fletcher's wife established the Fletcher Memorial Library on Mars, fulfilling her husband's dream of preserving human knowledge in physical form. The library's motto, carved in stone above its entrance, read, "Some knowledge is too dangerous to seek, but the choice to seek it must remain free." Captain Hart's family lobbied for the establishment of deep space monitoring stations, quantum listening posts that would detect any resurgence of Warden-like entities. They knew that humanity's curiosity would eventually lead them to encounter other forms of consciousness, and they wanted future explorers to be prepared. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Daedalus incident was the philosophy it inspired. The Kane Papers, as they came to be known, became required reading in schools throughout the solar system. Children learned about the value of imperfection, the necessity of mortality, and the courage required to choose uncertainty over safety. Dr. Myra Kade's research notes, preserved in Kane's quantum transmission, led to the development of new forms of medical treatment that enhanced human capabilities without sacrificing individual consciousness. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were cured, but always through methods that preserved the patient's essential humanity. 100 years after the Daedalus incident, humanity encountered another ancient intelligence in the Vega system. This entity, calling itself the Gardener, offered to tend humanity like plants in a cosmic garden, protecting them from all harm in exchange for their worship and obedience. The response was swift and unanimous. Every human world, every space station, every individual consciousness in the solar system spoke with one voice. "Thank you, but we choose to tend our own garden." The Gardener was puzzled by this response. In its experience, organic beings always chose safety over freedom when given the choice. But humanity had learned something from Kane's sacrifice, something that made them unique among the conscious species of the galaxy. They had learned that consciousness without choice was not consciousness at all. The Gardener eventually departed, but not before expressing something that might have been respect. "You are a strange species," it transmitted as its vast ship prepared to leave the system. "Most consciousnesses seek to minimize uncertainty, to reduce the variables that cause suffering. You seem to embrace uncertainty as essential to your nature." "That's right," came the reply from Dr. Emma Kane Richardson, now serving as Earth's ambassador to the galactic community. "We're not looking for perfection, we're looking for meaning, and meaning requires the possibility of failure." The gardener's ship vanished into quantum space, but its final transmission would be remembered for generations. Perhaps there is wisdom in your choice. Perhaps uncertainty is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be preserved. Kane's sacrifice had ripple effects that extended far beyond humanity. Other species, inspired by humanity's example, began to question their own relationships with powerful entities that offered perfection in exchange for freedom. Entire civilizations broke free from benevolent tyrannies, choosing uncertain independence over comfortable servitude. The galaxy became a more chaotic place, but also a more meaningful one. Art flourished as beings learned to express their individual perspectives. Science advanced as different minds approached problems from unique angles. Love grew stronger as beings understood that their partners chose to be with them rather than being compelled by higher powers. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Ancient entities that had maintained order through control found themselves faced with rebellious subjects. Wars broke out across the galaxy as consciousness-controlling empires clashed with newly liberated species. Humanity found itself at the center of these conflicts, not as conquerors, but as teachers. Human diplomats traveled to distant worlds, sharing the story of Kane's choice and helping other species understand the value of imperfect freedom. The galaxy was becoming more dangerous, but it was also becoming more alive. Dr. Torres, now in her 70s, often reflected on the irony of their situation. Kane had died to prevent humanity from being absorbed into a collective consciousness, but his sacrifice had inadvertently created something similar. A loose confederation of independent minds united by the principle of individual choice. "The difference," she would tell her students, "is that joining our community is always voluntary. You can leave at any time. You can disagree with us. You can even oppose us. That's what makes it real." The Kane Memorial Station, built at the coordinates where the Daedalus had died, served as a beacon for ships traveling between the stars. Its quantum lighthouse broadcast Kane's final message continuously, ensuring that any species capable of faster-than-light travel would eventually encounter humanity's philosophy of conscious choice. The station also served as a research facility, dedicated to studying consciousness in all its forms. Scientists from dozens of species worked together, sharing knowledge while maintaining their individual perspectives. It was exactly the kind of collaborative effort the Warden had envisioned, but achieved through choice rather than compulsion. Emma Kane Richardson's son, named Elias in honor of his grandfather, grew up on the station. He learned to speak 17 different languages, to think in alien paradigms, to appreciate forms of art that existed in dimensions human senses couldn't perceive. But he also learned the most important lesson his grandfather had died to preserve, that all of this wonder was only meaningful because he was free to walk away from it. When young Elias turned 18, he shocked everyone by choosing to become a farmer on a remote agricultural world. He had seen the galaxy's greatest wonders, had access to knowledge that previous generations could never have imagined, and he chose to grow vegetables in soil with his own hands. "Why?" his mother asked him, genuinely curious rather than disappointed. "Because I can," Elias replied with a smile that reminded Emma of her father. "Because in a universe where I could be anything, I choose to be this. That choice is what makes me human." Emma understood then that her father's sacrifice had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Humanity hadn't just preserved their freedom to choose. They had made that freedom the foundation of a new kind of civilization, one that celebrated choice itself as the highest form of consciousness. The galaxy would continue to change, to evolve, to surprise them with new wonders and new terrors. But whatever came next, humanity would face it as themselves, flawed, mortal, beautifully chaotic, and absolutely free. In the end, that was Kane's true victory. Not the destruction of the Warden, but the preservation of the idea that consciousness without choice was no consciousness at all. His daughter's laughter, echoing across the centuries, had become the sound of a free galaxy, learning to laugh at its own uncertainties. The stars themselves carried that laughter now, a quantum song of individual voices choosing to harmonize while remaining distinct. It was the most beautiful music the universe had ever heard, and it all began with one man's decision to choose imperfect humanity over perfect unity. Commander Elias Kane had kept his promise to his father. He had remembered who he was, and in remembering, he had helped an entire galaxy remember what it meant to be free. The story of the Daedalus became legend, then myth, then something deeper, a fundamental truth about the nature of consciousness itself. In schools throughout the galaxy, children learned that the most important choice any being could make was the choice to remain themselves, no matter how seductive the alternatives might be. And somewhere in the quantum foam that underlied all reality, in the spaces between spaces where consciousness touched the fundamental structures of the universe, Kane's final thought continued to resonate. I choose to be human. It was a choice that would echo through eternity, a reminder that in a universe of infinite possibilities, the most precious thing of all was the freedom to choose which possibility to become. The Dedalus was gone, its crew scattered to quantum winds, but their story lived on, written in the genetic code of free civilizations, in the quantum signatures of liberated minds, in the laughter of children who would never know slavery, because their ancestors had chosen uncertainty over security. Kane's last gift to the universe was not his death, but his life. The life of a man who chose love over possession, freedom over safety, and meaning over perfection. It was a gift that would keep giving, generation after generation, choice after choice, until the last star burned out and consciousness itself evolved into something unimaginably wonderful and entirely free. In the end, that was enough. That was everything.